The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild and The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt, our game of the year of 2017 against our game of the year of 2015. We're not alone in this opinion, as these two games are among the most awarded ever and prove that single-player games have never been better than during this generation.
Now that both are available on the Nintendo Switch, it's time for the greatest game versus game ever. Zelda Breath of the Wild against The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt. But first, make sure to leave a like and subscribe for more goodness like this.
We never thought we would see the day, but here we are, stacking up the Switch versions of two of our favorite games of all time. Two masterpieces that have granted us hundreds of hours of joy, frustration, but most of all satisfaction, and left us in awe over their grand adventures and brimming with life worlds. The best video games the White and Red, Japan and Poland, Nintendo, and CD Projekt Red have offered us in this generation. Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild and The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt. Both parts of the core soul of this channel since its beginning, and for this video I had to bring Joseph Ferris back, as he is as big of a Witcher and Zelda fanatic as me.
Witcher 3 launched to universal acclaim in May 2015, sits with a 93 on Metacritic, and is the most awarded video game of all time, with over 200 Game of the Year awards. A feat which is even more impressive since the game had to compete with the likes of Bloodborne, Fallout 4, Metal Gear Solid 5, and Super Mario Maker in the same year. Breath of the Wild, on the other hand, launched to equal universal acclaim in March 2017 and sits with a 97 on Metacritic, but with a lower user score of 8.5. Just like The Witcher, Breath of the Wild received a long list of Game of the Year awards, totaling up to 189, all for 2017, when it had to compete against titles like Horizon Zero Dawn, Persona 5, and Super Mario Odyssey. How do we even judge these two colossi of the video game industry? I know, in 7 categories: game world, story, gameplay, side quests, bosses, controls, and music. The video game war between The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild and The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt Complete Edition is about to break out. The most important factor for immersion in any open world game is the land we are given to explore. And in this category, both Breath of the Wild and Witcher 3 are masterpieces, though in different ways. Since where Breath of the Wild puts priority on variety in landscapes and nature, The Witcher favors medieval realism in its landscapes, villages, towns, and cities. For one, Hyrule is one complete, seamless entity or map, while the White Orchard, Velen with Novigrad, the Skellige Isles, Kaer Morhen, and Toussaint are all separate open-world areas. With that being said, there are some similarities, such as being able to deactivate nearly all of the HUD for an immersive and unobstructed experience. Another one is the Great Plateau and White Orchard, which serve similar purposes as tutorials and introductions to the plot areas. But upon departing these after our first taste of exploration and combat, the game worlds begin to differ.
Since every area in Breath of the Wild's Hyrule is connected without any loading screens when traveling by foot, shield surfing, climbing, paragliding, horse riding, and even rafting. Even teleporting from Sheikah Shrine to Shrika Shrine is very efficient, as it can be done from any location and with low loading times. The Witcher, on the other hand, needs loading times between the different maps, as Velen plus Novigrad is close to twice the size of Breath of the Wild's 61 square kilometer Hyrule. In terms of races, both have their own fair share of intelligent species, and some even share some similarities, such as the Hylians and the Gerudo to different races of humans, Sheikah and powerful witches, Gorons and trolls, Zoras and mermaids, vampires, and obviously unintelligible monsters. And in the last group, there's no doubt that The Witcher 3 has the greater variety and the harder to beat mythological creatures, especially on more advanced difficulties, but more on that in the gameplay and bosses sections. Now, we could talk about the great wealth of both games for hours, but we have 6 more categories to go over, so we need to keep it brief and tell straight out which game does what better.
Breath of the Wild has more diverse provinces, which cover nearly all landscapes from our own world and grants more freedom to the player, as it takes advantage of the air and with it turns the game from an open world to an open air experience. Well, that and climbing nearly any structure as long as we have enough stamina gradually opens the world to us. In other words, Breath of the Wild tackles the wild better with its emphasis on organic physics, weather, temperature, and most of all, the sense of discovery without pointing out quests on a map. A detail which we will return to in the gameplay section. The Witcher has way more objectives and content in its world. It is less barren, more alive, in everything from the variety and size of monsters, urban environments, and cities, which are much bigger and detailed than in Breath of the Wild. However, natural elements such as physics, weather, and temperature do not have the same impact as in Hyrule, and the game is not endless, as monsters are not revived after killing them. This is not the case for Breath of the Wild, as all enemies and overworld bosses are respawned with every blood moon, which makes it possible to play this game daily, even years after finishing your first playthrough. Both game worlds are excellent in their own right, but Breath of the Wild has that organic flair in its own world that even one of the best cities in video game history is not able to outmatch. The first category goes to Breath of the Wild.
Having an open world bursting with life isn't enough if it doesn't come with a proper story that will truly make you feel as being the character or part of the world you play in. The Witcher 3 is the definition of an epic final to Geralt of Rivia's long journey of discovery, growth, monster hunting, and fulfillment. The story of the Wild Hunt is in many ways Geralt's commitment to locate and then protect his adopted daughter Ciri from the Wild Hunt and also influence her path in regards to her blood right to the Empire of Nilfgaard's throne. Throughout this journey, playing as Geralt and Ciri, we encounter new and old friends and enemies who will set them on a path of difficult choices and battles. And this is the main emphasis of the story of The Witcher 3. It is not set in stone and can be altered based on the decisions you make and alliances you build across your quest in the White Orchard, occupied Vizima Royal Palace, the Wastelands of Velen, the intolerant Kingdom of Redania, the witch and sorcery-hating free city of Novigrad, the Skellige Isles, the Witcher stronghold Kaer Morhen, and Toussaint, the land of blood and wine. In other words, The Witcher 3's story and main quest unfolds much like a novel, and it is fitting as the Witcher game series is based on the locations and characters found in Andrzej Sapkowski's novels. Only that unlike the novels, which are completely linear, the story can go a number of different directions with branching paths and a number of different outcomes in the games that will impact even how you face later bosses in the game.
In contrast, Breath of the Wild's story of reclaiming your painful memories and turning defeat 100 years ago into victory a century later by reclaiming the divine beasts and freeing Princess Zelda is simple and lacks the structure and engagement found in The Witcher. Let me explain. In The Witcher 3, even most of the cutscenes related to Ciri told in flashbacks have OP gameplay sequences where you play as Geralt's adopted daughter, while in Breath of the Wild, all memories are only, well, cutscenes that are simply activated, and within these, there are no gameplay sequences. Thus, they lack the same build-up, and it also doesn't help that the majority of the story is fragmented and scattered across the land of Hyrule. Obviously, this is attached to the non-linear nature of the game, which can be tackled in different ways, such as skipping dungeons completely and going straight for the final boss in Hyrule Castle's Sanctum. Just because The Witcher 3 has a more complex story doesn't automatically make it win, but Breath of the Wild's story is just too bare bones compared to The Witcher's story, which has bestseller novel-like storytelling, build-up, and structure. The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt wins this category by a landslide.
An open world game with an amazing world and story will never become a masterpiece unless it provides great gameplay. Luckily for Zelda and The Witcher, they are the absolute crown elite in this field. Take Breath of the Wild for instance. This game changed what we define as an open world by turning it into an open-air organic experience where many elements of the world we are in can be impacted by physics. A perfect example of this are the key mechanics of the game, the Sheikah Slate and its runes, which allows you to freeze objects and enemies in time, lift and throw giant metal crates, throw proximity bombs, and, in a way, even walk on water. All of these mechanics are instrumental to conquer the wild and dangerous world of Hyrule, on top of dodging enemy attacks or firing arrows mid-air for flurry rushes and arrow time focus. The gameplay in this next level Zelda and open world game is as fluent as it gets, and the world is at your command. Unless it kills you with lightning strikes or rain. Yes, we haven't even talked about the greatest game changers yet. Climbing, jumping and gliding. 3 revolutionary concepts that removed all previous boundaries found in the Zelda series. Thanks to these abilities, and being able to chop down trees, mine minerals, upgrade a long list of apparel and so much more, this game simply surpassed every game prior when it comes to gameplay, including a long, and then we mean a long list of weapons and shields.
Though there is one flaw, and that is breaking weapons, which, unlike The Witcher, cannot be repaired by visiting a blacksmith. And The Witcher has moreover Breath of the Wild, such as a number of difficulty settings which change how monsters behave, attack, and the damage they deal, requiring you to adapt and use special oils and stones to your 2 blades, one for humans and one for monsters, and consuming special enhancing elixirs. The Witcher 3 also has its runes for attacks, which in classic RPG fashion are upgradable. And this is another point in The Witcher's favor, as killing monsters is a necessity to earn money to level up and face stronger and stronger foes. In Breath of the Wild, we also find some of the same incentives in order to upgrade gear, but the way more fragile weapons do not exactly encourage fighting all the enemies you encounter. This category is a tough one, as both games have their advantages and disadvantages. A good example being horse riding and sailing, the first one being way better in Breath of the Wild, and the latter in The Witcher. Just as for Game World, you will find things that are different between the two. Still, since we have to pick a winner in this category, then we have to go with Breath of the Wild, as it narrowly knocks out The Witcher thanks to its game-changing physics and organic gameplay.
You can't have games like these without side quests, can you? And if we're talking about a franchise that is known for its side quests and side activities, it's Zelda. We have been going on and on about Zelda side quests in other episodes of Game vs. Game, but every time we pit Breath of the Wild against other Zelda games, it tends to lose the side quest category, and for good reason. To this day, we still have trouble trying to remember any significant side quests from the game, aside from the long-winded and fascinating Tarry Town quest, and the cast's shrine quests. Other than that, the majority of side quests in Breath of the Wild are fetch quests and treasure hunts. While these are the quests that are strictly labeled side quests, there are other activities that will keep you distracted from the main story, such as the shrines and shrine quests. Some of the shrine quests are as simple as the side ones, but they tend to have more depth, like the Stolen Heirloom quest that contains a heartbreaking tale. We wish more of Breath of the Wild side quests were like this, but even then, they don't come close to the ones in The Witcher 3. If there's one reason The Witcher 3 won all those Game of the Year awards in 2015 instead of Metal Gear Solid 5 and Fallout 4, it was because CD Projekt Red redefined what the term side quest means. You would be hard pressed to find a side quest or Witcher contract in this game that didn't have a meaningful layer of story to it, and some of them even have an impact on the main story, which can't be said for Breath of the Wild.
These type of quests make the world come alive even further, and make every NPC that much more realistic. It is very clear that CD Projekt Red wants to make every side quest meaningful, and not just as simple as, go here and get this. There is also Gwent, the card game, which was great enough to be turned into a separate video game, but I personally don't have any patience to try and learn. Breath of the Wild doesn't even come close to the amount of depth that The Witcher 3's side quests contain. But to be fair, not many games do, which is why it wins the battle for side quests. Because The Witcher 3 is about a guy that hunts monsters for a living, safe to say there are more bosses in this game than in Breath of the Wild. But does more always mean better? The bosses in Breath of the Wild can be found spontaneously in the open world, and at the end of dungeons. The puppet Ganons you fight at the end of Divine Beasts have different powers, but are visually similar to one another, making them not very interesting. Especially disappointing when other Zelda games are known for variety in their bosses. The more interesting ones can be found in the open world, like the Stone Taluses, Hinoxes, Guardians, Lynels, and Moldugas. They all have to be taken down in different ways. If you go in unprepared, and then in particular in the first few hours of the game, you will lose hands down. The same can be said for The Witcher 3, where you have to prepare accordingly for a beast you know you're about to fight through Witcher contracts. You will also take on bosses going through the main story, such as the Wild Hunt. Fighting these monsters takes some skill, meaning you'll have to know when to dodge, deflect, use magic, etc. It's not like the monsters have a giant weak points like in Breath of the Wild, but to say they are slogs to get through would be a lie. Even though Breath of the Wild's bosses might be more fun to battle from a technical standpoint, they simply cannot beat the variety found in The Witcher 3's bosses and Witcher contracts. There are so many monsters you will encounter throughout your over 100-hour playthrough that there is no way Breath of the Wild could even compete with that. The Witcher 3 wins the battle for bosses by a landslide.
By comparing these two games right off the bat, you can tell which one of them is more easily accessible. Breath of the Wild is not as much of an action RPG as The Witcher 3 is, and part of the reason why is because of its controls, something Nintendo has mastered since the 80s. Link feels great to control, his actions are responsive, and he can climb and glide anywhere he pleases, making world traversal that much more fun. This also carries over to the combat, where even the most difficult enemies feel like a fair challenge, thanks to the controls. If The Witcher 3 had controls as smooth and responsive as these, it would be even more of an amazing game than it already is. Unfortunately, that isn't the case. While the controls don't feel bad, they could feel much better, especially when walking and running around. Sometimes Geralt has trouble stopping right away, which can be frustrating when you're trying to loot up objects and talk to people. It is a relative minor issue, but an issue nonetheless. He also doesn't feel as responsive as Link when fighting other enemies, and it doesn't help that combat takes a lot more focus and fast thinking than it does in Breath of the Wild. We could go on, but I think our point has been made. Breath of the Wild is the victor in the battle for controls.
So we have a draw prior to this last category, but we will for sure not have it after this one, as Breath of the Wild soundtrack doesn't even come close to the top of the list when compared to the rest of the Zelda games. So why would it top The Witcher 3's already amazing soundtrack? It can't, as music is everywhere in The Witcher, and it is pure quality from beginning to end, with a massive highlight in Priscilla's song in Novigrad. A super emotional and deep example of how music and song can be used to convey emotions and tell the tale of an equally deep character. Breath of the Wild does have a similar moment with Cass, but despite similarities, it comes as no surprise that the soundtrack in Breath of the Wild is heavily underused and one of the prime features that Breath of the Wild 2 can build upon. We love both soundtracks, the deeply Slavic, energetic, and moodful pulse of The Witcher, and the heroic and ambient tone of Breath of the Wild. But what determines the victor in this category is the use of its music. The Witcher 3 takes this one and the total victory, though it is as close as it gets between these two video game giants. We love both games equally, but this video has been an example of what Breath of the Wild knocks out of the park and what The Witcher 3 thus better and can be used as sources of improvement for Breath of the Wild 2. The most clear of these being filling out the world of Hyrule even more, providing a better story, side quests, bosses, and usage of music. Oh, and that the expansion pass is included in the base package on the Nintendo Switch and sold separately 2 years after its release.
Still, we have one thing left to determine before we end, and that is The Witcher's performance on the Switch. In handheld mode it looks great, and the port is overall a massive technical accomplishment. on a 32GB cartridge. With that being said, in TV mode, especially on big screens above 40 inches, the Switch hardware shows its signs. But even then, 720p 30 frames per second docked and 540p 30 frames per second undocked, no audio issues with little to no frame rate drops with this level of scope and detail is an achievement like no other. Anyways, a big thanks to Joseph from Ferris Wheel Pro for joining me for this special video, and he will also be returning for another video sooner than you think. So to not miss that one and many more upcoming Zelda Breath of the Wild, Nintendo Switch and more gaming videos, make sure to leave a like on this video, subscribe and press that shiny notification bell for all notifications. Finally, a big thanks to all of you for watching and to our patrons.